Welcome, everyone, to our panel on Queens and Crowns and Writing Women in Historical Fiction. I'm Dr. Rosanne Welch. I represent the Stevens College MFA in TV and Screenwriting. I'm going to throw our little link there because on our website we have some other previous panels that we've recorded that all have to do with writing for female characters, which is our focus. And so we're excited that you've joined us today to speak with three writers on some very female-focused shows. We want to talk about what it's like to write women in the past, to understand the real part of their world and how that can best be represented. We want to talk about the creativity involved and trying to understand their lives and how we can put them across to a modern audience. So I'm excited to be joined by folks from some three very different shows. We very much wanted to have to prove that period doesn't just mean in the way back where people wear corsets and bodices and things like that. We wanted to see that any period, of course, is a time that we haven't lived in and we want to know more about. So I thank you all for being with us today. We're really excited to get started. And I'm going to start with the first question, which is for everyone. We'll go one at a time. It's going to be, what part of living in the area that your show comes from do you enjoy experiencing most and studying most and bringing into your show? What part of that world did you find most interesting? Who wants to start?
I'll go first if you
Please.
I would say that, on Outlander, we're kind of we fall into an interesting kind of category in the sense that, Claire, our leading character, and her daughter Brianna are from, the 1940s and 1960s respectively, and they fall back in time. So you've got that kind of dual layering of where you're trying to kind of think about what it's like to be a 1960s woman and what Claire might have in mind and how she then adapts to the 18th century. So I really enjoy kind of the challenge of going into two different headspaces in that sense. So I think that's something that's kind of, keeps us on our toes in that sense.
And I do love that idea because exactly, you're looking at women in two different time periods and trying to understand them both fairly and trying to get into the second from the first one that isn't yet your own time period.
Exactly.
The layers of that are beautiful. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Who wants to go next?
I'm happy to go.
Go for it.
I think it was, something that we were trying to do on Dickinson all the time was to find the connections between the 19th century and the present day. That was very much a focus of our show, and I think it's clear from the tone that's what we were trying to do. So it was trying to find those connections. It was going into the research and seeing what bubbled up and being like, oh wow, that's really so similar to today. And we have this image of the past as being very stilted, people talking in various accents, but some things just really haven't changed at all. And it can be really fun to just, put whatever that thing is being spoken in the mouths of people who are just wearing different costumes and just letting it pop like that. So, and the 19th century is full of stuff like that. You'd be amazed how little has changed.
And that's part of the interesting thing about historical fiction. We realize that we haven't moved as forward as much as we want, but there are steps we've seen taken. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of looking at the past. We're really looking at ourselves in the same way we say with science fiction, it's really talking about ourselves. Oh, very cool. Cool. And Danielle, what do you think? Amberia, what do you think?
So I would say, I write on the Wonder Years, which takes place in the late 60s, which is a pretty tumultuous time. And it centers on a Black family. So, when they announced the reboot of the show, a lot of the talk on Twitter was, well, those weren't Wonder Years. Those weren't great years. Like, so the question of what would you enjoy about that time, or what do I enjoy about going back into that time? I've enjoyed the process of finding out what people who lived during that time enjoyed, right? Because we have our idea of what it was, and we have our facts about what it was, but it's nice to go into people's interior lives and talking to folks that I know, and other folks kind of doing that same thing on the research team or in the writer's room, and kind of just getting into what was fun, what was good, what was enjoyable. And you find little surprises in there. So that's been nice.
Oh, that's wonderful. You're going to make me ask, you're going to make me jump ahead my questions to a surprise that you found. What is something you learned about the time period and studying it that you've enjoyed adding to the show? And that's open to everybody, but go first. Go ahead.
I need to think about that, because there are some surprises, but they're not great ones. So yeah, let me think.
Okay. Go ahead. And they don't have to be happy. The idea being it was something you didn't know about that time that you're happy to illustrate to other people using the show as your medium.
Yeah, if anyone else has something that comes to mind immediately, then please jump in while I give it a little thought.
A cool piece of research. What's something fun?
I mean, I think for something that comes to mind for me was, I'm thinking particularly of our second season, and which was all about fame, and how Emily Dickinson responded to fame, was concerned about fame, how it influenced her poetry, how it influenced her decision not to publish. And what I sort of didn't realize is that fame was really kind of coming into being at that time. The photograph had sort of just been invented. And, so people, she had a photograph of, George Eliot up in her room, which is a very, modern thing to do, to have, a poster of your idol in your room. And so that was a surprise. I wouldn't have thought that the idea of celebrity was even that old. So that was, and that was brilliant, because it just fit straight into a theme we were trying to explore. So that was a surprise and a pleasant one. I'm sure there were ones that weren't.
But that's an excellent example, because also you did the wonderful episode where you explored Walden Pond and the whole concept of Thoreau, and was he or not someone who should be worshipped or enjoyed.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I probably didn't know Thoreau was quite as obnoxious as I found out when I read it. No, I'm being mean, but I think that's a good example.
Excellent. Danielle, what do you think about a thing you discovered that you enjoyed?
I mean, in terms of sort of there is the sort of medical aspect to Outlander. That's always really interesting. In fact, I actually struggle to sit through some of our meetings with consultants, because I find it so visceral that I find it challenging to hear about how if you get stabbed in the thigh, you've only got 11 seconds to live. And, all of the sort of, Culloden battlefields type things. I know that we take great care over that, and the team really works so hard to kind of give a sensitive, accurate portrayal of what goes on in the battlefield. And I do find some of that, that's not so surprising, I suppose, but I think probably where I'm going with that is that, Claire, our protagonist, is, she's having to bring 1960s techniques. And sometimes it's interesting to find out which medical procedures stood the test of time, or were, that 18th century characters weren't aware of. And so that's been something that sticks out.
So fun. It's true. I really enjoy that aspect of watching her use nursing skills that belong in one period in the other period. And then, of course, is that witchcraft, or is that
exactly it's good hygiene or something, that other people at the time, to them it's something incredible, but something to us that's pretty normal. Even things like CPR and those sorts of things. Yeah.
Very cool.
That's very cool. I really love that, about kind of juxtaposing two worlds that shouldn't be that different, but I think it's just things that we take for granted. Surprising things. It's hard to be surprised by the 1960s, maybe just as a cynical Black woman. A lot of things don't surprise me when I'm doing a show about the South. But I will say, when we think about story ideas and coming of age, right, we're thinking about things that are traditional rites of passage for boys and girls and women of the era. And we just, we're pitching out things like Boy Scouts and, certain auxiliary organizations. And then we go back and we research them and we're like, oh, these are white supremacist organizations, or the roots of them are all, and it's things we don't think about, we're not surprised by. But it just shows the ways in which so many things that are just innocuous or things that are kind of just embedded into our fabric of like, what does it mean to be just a traditional citizen? Or what does it mean to grow up and have a normal childhood? Are not things that mean the same thing for every kid. So how do we go into those worlds and be honest about them, but also be honest about the fact that kids weren't aware of the roots of those organizations and still wanted to participate in them in the same way. So how are you honest about that? So that's an interesting dance that we have to do, because it's a real thing, you know.
Well, that's so true. And there's a poignancy to the idea that a child not knowing the roots of something wants to belong because they see other people belonging. And how do you walk that walk and explain things? Oh, that's beautiful. That is something I've noticed on the show very much so. Cool. I love that. Excellent. Excellent. So my other question is, could you have lived in the period that you're writing about? Could you personally have lived in that period?
I mean, there's a different, I mean, I could have. Whether I would want it to is another matter. You know, our show is ramping up towards a very bloody civil war. So, you know, it's definitely not top of my list of times I would choose.
Yeah, wouldn't have been good for you, I feel.
No, no. I would have definitely been drafted.
True. That's quite true. Interesting. And that, of course, is an issue that would have faced a male character in that period that would not have faced a female character.
Yeah, and you know, it's that was an interesting, you know, drafting is actually something that came up and one of our characters was actually a draft dodger. And so that was an interesting moment where we had to sort of decide what we were going to do about that, try and honor you know, if you were a wealthy man back then, you could pay to have someone go in your stead, which is crazy to contemplate. And Emily's brother did that. And so then it was about figuring out, how does that fit our story? How does, you know, we've built a version of her brother up to this point who's probably different in many ways to the one. How do we stay to the truth of that choice that he made, but also not completely lose him and our affection for him? That was an interesting one, and Emily's role was very central to that.
So you've just spoken to two very important issues for a writer. One, not losing the love of the character. If he's going to have to do something, he or she is going to have to do something that we might not appreciate. And then how to keep your central character key to the decision that another character is making. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Danielle, what do you think? Could you have lived in either the World War II period, or if we go all the way back?
I think so. I'd like to think that I could, you know, make my way by just through, you know, the amount of research and things. And actually, it's something that Roger, one of our characters, who's a professor at Oxford in the 60s, and he goes back to the 18th century and he's having to, you know, kind of grapple with that idea. And I think this is what I'm getting at, which is, you know, there are beautiful elements to it, but living history is a different matter, and it is a living thing, and it's ever changing and it's ever evolving, and we're living through history right now, you know. And I think it's that question you ask yourself, what would I have done if I was confronted with these obstacles? You like to think that you'd be courageous and brave and do the right thing. But I suppose that's something that weighs on my mind a lot, especially currently on the show. You know, we're in the period of the American Revolution, and Jamie says at one point, you know, what's a dream for some is a nightmare for others. And I think that rings true for me. And I think that's where I would maybe feel a bit kind of, you know, find it hard to find my place there in that world. For sure. And I probably would have died in childbirth, I think, as well, because I think I don't know that I would be able to get through any of that sort of stuff, all the medical things, as I say.
Sadly, it's true. I remember reading that until the 1940s, the number one way women died was in childbirth. So we're not talking about something that's an ancient piece of history. It goes all the way up until that time frame.
Exactly.
Another very strange mode of death was dresses being set on fire by standing too close to the stove, in terms of fascinating things you read about, It was like number 2 death or something like that. So we put it in the show.
It was exactly the number 2. You either died in childbirth or you got set on fire because of all the clothing you wore. Is that amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very
that's the kind of research.
gendered ways of dying. that are like-
Very true.
and you can't breathe in that thing in the first place. So it's just, yeah, that's just a recipe for.
And you can't unbutton it because it's all someone's got to. You can't. You're trapped in this. Exactly. Now, how about you? What did you think about?
I guess I will echo a lot of the things that Danielle said. Is you always think of, if I were standing in the middle of the revolution, I would one be standing in the middle of the revolution, right? I wouldn't be the person at home. I'd like to think that, when I talk to a lot of my in-laws about they lived in Birmingham at this very time, and they were like, Christian, conservative Christian, Black family, and the word was, we don't go out and we don't cause a stir. But did they consider themselves to be revolutionary at the time? Yes, in their own way. Did they believe, some of those revolutionary beliefs? And they're not even revolutionary. I mean, justice and equality are not revolutionary ideas, right? But they were and still are. But we all like to think that we'd be, in the center of the fight. And I think what I've learned is that the fight looks different for different folks. There are different stakes for different people engaging in the fight. And you kind of got to honor that, those realities, and not hate characters for their choices. As much as they may feel like betrayals or, so I think that's kind of what I learned about kind of trying to place myself is, I'm placed in this moment in history. So it's hard to go back and say what I would have done. I can say what I would have liked to do. But who knows? And I think all of that is shaped by literally all of the intersections of your life at that moment. What kind of choices could you have made and what it would have cost you,
That's a beautiful phrase. Exactly. What would it have cost you? And then we look back at those people who did make those choices and do wish that we could be as heroic as we envision they were.
Yeah. And some people could have, and they just didn't, and that's why stakes are important, because, it's different, levels of danger in terms of making good choices. But yes.
That's true. I remember reading that some African-American professors at universities didn't want to walk off the job because they knew how important it was to be there to educate people and they couldn't lose their jobs, but they didn't write their students off as being absent when they protested. And that was their way of contributing to allowing them to make a move they could make. And it was an interesting decision to find, how do I get my way in here without losing everything else?
Sure.
Oh, that's fascinating. Very cool. Very cool. So we briefly chatted about how we place women in the past honestly and realistically. So what do you think about something you discovered in your research that was true to a female's life that you're happy that you were able to fit into one of your stories?
I mean, we had so many of these. I mean, this is basically our entire show. Was Elena, our showrunner and the creator of the show, would always say if we were to actually tell the true story of Emily Dickinson, it would just be doing chores all day. And so, we were always trying to expand her mind out, but also what about those chores was interesting? How could we spin episodes out of it? There was a great one of my favorite episodes. We read that Emily had actually won a baking contest, and so then it's like, okay, well, that's really fun. How does that fit into the theme of our season? This was a season all about fame, so it was like, okay, well, if she wins this baking contest, maybe that's a way for her to experience a small dose of fame, and sort of experience it on a small level, and then have some ideas about it, what it might mean on a huge level. So there's so much opportunity and fun in that, and just finding the mundanity of someone's day or what was exciting to them at the time, and then trying to fit that into your story.
Beautiful. Thank you. Danielle or Amberia?
I would say, yeah, similar to Robbie, that I mean, for Claire, she really is kind of having to navigate through a world where, you know, men are in charge, and she's frequently, you know, kind of looked down upon or told that she's a witch, or, you know, kind of you know, treated poorly. And I think, you know, showing that she's able, she basically teaches Jamie that, you know, equality within a loving relationship is important, and, you know, that they are equals, and that, you know, there's a, you know, an episode in season 1 where he sort of infamously, after they're married, he beats, you know, wants to beat her, and she sort of has to put him in his place and say, you know, this is not how it's going to be. This may be the way that men in this time, this may be what husbands do here, but I am not this, you know, that's not me. You're not doing that to me. And I think, you know, those sorts of elements in the sort of the more micro scope of the kind of intimate relationships, I really enjoy that we're able to kind of play with that relationship dynamic, I think. Yeah.
Beautiful. True. In her personal life, how she takes control. Exactly. Amberia.
Is the question, can you repeat the question just to make sure that I answer it? A
Oh,
pet
yeah.
peeve is when questions are asked and people answer something completely different. So I don't want to be that person on the panel today.
No. Thinking about something you learned about, you know, the truth of a woman's life in that period, and how you were able to bring that piece into one of the storylines for one of the female characters on the show, the mom, the sister.
Yeah, I you know, last night's or this week's episode is a good example. It was about, you know, the family wanting to join you know, traditionally Black social club. And, you know, the truth of those clubs is complicated. And that's something that we had to confront as like, do we want to tell that story? Because that story kind of looks bad, but it is real. And there were certain, you know, elements of social capital and cultural capital that you get from being a part of them. And we got to kind of have to navigate that in front of a wide audience, right? So there's certain things that are inside to Black people, but it's not Black people watching, just Black people watching the show. So how do we tell that story to a wide audience, and not betray certain elements of what's inside to Black culture and things that people may not understand? So there's a very gentle way we had to tell the story about not just Lillian and skin color, and how she navigates being a working mom, and then also looking at Kim, who's 16, and her seeing this organization as classist, and how they kind of collide in that way. So it was a very honest story, but it was one that wasn't easy to tell, for a number of reasons. But I think we did a good job and still made it funny. So
And there's no
it
reason
has
for
to
it
be funny. Yeah.
And there's no reason for it to be easy, because it's
Sure.
an interesting piece of, even though it's a comedy, there's conflict, and it's coming from the child's eyes, right? Kevin is learning. And
Right.
so, exactly. Oh yeah, it doesn't have to be easy. It just has to be interesting.
Well, I have to write it. That's why I'm like, can it just be a little easier?
Oh, that's too funny. Very cool. Now, I'm going to go to something Robbie hit on that I do want to hit on with everybody, which is this idea that every series has an overarching theme, and then of course individual episodes address that theme and sometimes have smaller themes. So if you were describing your show and thinking about, you know, what it has to say about a female in this time period, what are the themes that you work with largely? What are the themes you think of? We've talked a little bit about fame with Dickinson, but that's not the only theme. So what would you say is the overarching theme that helps you decide on storylines for your female characters?
I mean, you know, I think just speaking for Dickinson, you know, we had sort of a theme for kind of each season that we were kind of working towards. So fame was season 2, season 1 was sort of love and her relationship with her father in particular, and then season 3 was all about hope, and how can one bring hope as an artist. I think because it was a show about an artist, it was really about the struggle to make art, and the why, basically, and particularly what was it like for someone in that period who was a woman. What was she up against? Why has she stood the test of time? And it was always tricky to try and keep it fun, because it's very easy when the theme is art and that to just get very kind of serious and interior. So it was always like, okay, well, these are kind of important things. Now, how do we tell a fun little story here and go off on this little adventure? Sorry, I've lost track of the question. Was
The themes, the overarching theme of the series,
yeah.
and then individual themes you'll like to explore. Cool. Danielle or Amberia?
I would say our theme, it's centered on Dean's POV, but for everyone is like, what is the American dream? It's more of a question than it is a theme. But that's what everyone's in pursuit of, is like, what is that? Is that a real thing? What does that mean to me? And what is that going to mean to me over the course of these different, hopefully seasons? What does that look like?
And that is a theme, right? People searching for the American dream, definitely. And even seeing it from the different eyes. The parents believe that going to college is the dream.
Sure.
She just was believing originally that that wasn't necessary, that it was this other, basically she's, the burgeoning hippie, if you will, or the burgeoning protester. And so
Sure.
she sees that other dream. I think that's a really beautiful thing to explore. Very cool. Then, yeah.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, I think, it's very centered on love, the show, and what people will do for a love that they think is going to last a lifetime. And, will you go back in time 200 years? Would you risk your life to do that, to go back to that one person that you love? And what's it like to be separated from that person, which that does happen to Claire as well. And then, with that, finding your place in the world. And I think, for Claire, she does have to constantly kind of adapt. And so I think adapting probably is one of the themes, because she does have to kind of continuously change herself. And, she goes through different seasons of life, as we all do. And, she's continually sort of relearning what it means to be where she is and how to find her way home, I think, and what that means to be an Outlander, I suppose.
And, now we're going all the way back to the Wizard of Oz and beyond, right? It's all about finding your way home. Which
Exactly.
is a major universal theme.
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I see a little question here in the Q&A that I want to cover, and it has to do with poetic license and how obligated do you feel you need to be to the quote unquote true history of your period, and how much do you feel you can play a little bit because of the need to create drama, to create something that's engaging and interesting along the way?
I always think that's sort of the big question when it comes to doing anything historical is what do you owe these characters? And it really varies, because a lot of it has to do with how far back in the past they are. If you're doing a story about Cleopatra, you probably owe her a little bit less than if you're doing a story about a very nearly contemporary female figure. I would say that you can never certainly, Dickinson is, when people watch Dickinson, I think they know pretty quickly this is not not a real accurate depiction of exactly what life was like there. But I think it's always about trying to find the resonant truth that connects the period of history you've chosen with the present day. You can't time travel, so it's about what is that truth you're trying to get to. In the case of Emily, it was her poetry, and how vibrant and alive that was, and how ahead of its time it was. And we felt like that was the thing that really deserved to be, preserved and paid homage to. But if someone's trying to do a much more, something that's much more accurate, they still have to choose the thing that is relevant and the themes that are relevant. And it's about filling the gaps. Your job is to fill in the gaps between the markers of history that we know, and sometimes those gaps are very narrow and sometimes they're very big, but you can never give a completely truthful rendition, nor should you try to.
They're not documentaries.
No.
Exactly. Excellent. What do you guys think, Danielle or Amberia, in terms of how obligated you are and where you use poetic license?
I mean, I think, with Outlander, we're lucky in that the fantasy supernatural element of the time travel allows us that little bit of freedom. But I would say once we are in a certain period, we do try to kind of stay within that world that we've built, and we try to follow the rules of it. So, if you've got your etiquette, your bowing and your curtsying and all that, you don't want your characters to suddenly start, I don't know, twerking or doing handshakes or, so I think that's, those sort of boundaries between physical boundaries between characters is very important to us in the 18th century past. And yeah, I mean, we do try to be as sensitive and sort of have as much integrity for the sake of the source material, the books that we're obviously adapting, but being faithful to the actual historical events. And we try to use as many resources as we have available, because as I say, I think it's important that scholarship changes frequently, so you have to kind of continuously, just because you read something once in a book from 1970 doesn't mean that that's valid today, even if it's referring to a different time period. So I think we do really try to be on top of the research as we can, but obviously, I mean, it's people devote their lives to studying the American Revolution, for example, so you can never kind of have a complete accurate portrayal, as Robbie said, but yeah, I think we try to be as accurate as we can.
Beautiful. Amber.
Yeah, I would say the same. We try to, I mean, we're in a place where we can't remake a reality. But I think even just outside of the historical circumstances, just in terms of like what's culturally relevant, there were a lot of comparisons to a young Kevin Arnold and a young Dean Williams. And, Kevin had this kind of this character that was very like loud, and he would talk back, and he, and I'm like, well, Dean is a little Black child of the South, and that's not real. Like that identity is not real. It was not accessible. Like we're talking about stakes. There were different stakes, for that type of personality. It just meant different things. And I think that's a way that we try to be honest. It's something that we often discuss in the room. Like he wouldn't say that, he wouldn't talk back, he wouldn't do this, and it's the same for the women in the show, right? Like as much as we want Kim to be a protester, and like when she's in the house, that doesn't fly, right? So there are spaces in which those personalities are vocal, and then other spaces where they're not. So I think the character can be different, right? The character can have a personality complex that we may not imagine for that time period, but the circumstances should be honest. I guess that's my rule, is I can't change what was real, but I can have a person living inside those circumstances that reacts to them in different ways that maybe I wouldn't anticipate for someone in 1968.
That's perfect.
If that makes sense.
It does. Exactly. It's go back to the concept that it's a dance that you're playing with.
Yeah.
And build off that question. And I've also seen this question in the Q&A. Of course, people want to know, how much research did you do? How much research do you continually do? What do you involve in your research? Is this scholarly reading? Do you have consultants? Did you personally go out and deal with certain things that you wanted to know, maybe that wasn't even advised by the showrunner? How did you decide, and how much time do you still spend researching that period?
Actually, I'm very interested in knowing what you two, like, how much is involved? How much reading are you doing? What's on the menu for you too?
Well, our show just came to an end, so I would say my reading has dipped a little bit compared to what it was. But we did tons and tons of research. I mean, she has almost 2,000 poems, so that was one thing. But then, she also has this incredibly rich biography. She was an amazing letter writer. There were so many things, I mean, Elena, who created the show, had been living with this stuff for almost 10 years, I think, before she even got to make it. So just tons of stuff, but also also something she would always try to encourage was to not just necessarily limit it to the stuff of the period, because obviously there were the biographical books you could read and pull out all these great details, but we'd go off and read some Dante or something like that, and then try and do an episode based on that. Or we would read a book like Emergent Strategy and try and kind of bring that in. So sometimes, particularly if you're trying to bring a contemporary look to the show and try and explore contemporary themes, you want to try and read what's current, what's going on, and marry those two. So it was all over the place is the short way of saying it.
Excellent. And I know someone's going to follow this up with, I've seen, did you have also a historical consultant or not?
Yeah, we did. We had a few actually, and often they would come into the room, and we would have a very fun day, just kind of talking to them, and they would give us incredible gems. I mean, Martha Nell Smith, who's an amazing Dickinson scholar, came in for one day. Just a couple of things she said the minute she got off the call sparked the rest of the day, and we churned out this whole episode basically, or at least a storyline for an episode based off one thing she said. So that stuff's invaluable, and you never know what's going to come of it. That's what's so great about it.
Beautiful. Danielle or Amberia, what's your research world like?
Well, I actually came to the show as a historical consultant, so I would frequently, my background is in research and of the 18th century, so that kind of gave me a little tiny head, leg up on that element. But no, I would say it's constantly ongoing, and we, try to rely on sort of a kaleidoscope of different resources from other consultants who specialize in whether it's, the Battle of Culloden, or, Gaelic consultants for some of the Scottish elements of language and things like that. But yeah, I mean, we're also lucky that we had the source material, and, the author Diana Gabaldon, did a lot of her own research. We have that as a foundation for, starting from. So that's really helpful for sure.
What is your particular area of research, Danielle? What were you working on, or were you?
Yeah, I don't want to bore everybody with the details, but basically it's I did sort of nation building and eco-criticism in 18th century post-revolutionary France. So it's very kind of weirdly niche, probably. I mean, yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago now, but I think, in terms of the literature aspect, I did kind of focus a lot on 18th century literature of all sorts of different things, so that kind of helped. And I think the theoretical approaches as well that you learn while you're in grad school, or I think that sometimes helps you to kind of be critical. Hopefully, I know criticism is often difficult, but I think it also helps to kind of be critical of the information that you're receiving when you're doing research, because I think it's really important to kind of, that's something that we try and do, is to kind of as I say, just because you read something written down somewhere, I think a lot of people these days seem to feel that that history is stuck in the past, but it's not. It's it's still, we're still learning about it. So yeah, sorry, I'm really rambly.
No, I love it. I'll ask more follow-up questions when we're not on, when we're offline.
Oh, no, feel free to do it now as well.
Your very niche research sounds super cool. We don't have historical consultants. I mean, our show doesn't really do deep dives into, specific issues. It's kind of up to us. But we do have a really, really, really smart room, a really, really well-educated room. And it's really well balanced in a way. And I will say that, what's helpful is, we got, some gender scholars in the room. So we it really helps when we're writing stories about women to kind of balance it, because we're not just talking about women of the era, we're talking about Black women in the era, and that the realities of middle-class Black life are specific, they're very particular. So, when we want to name check certain books, I'm like, yeah, I don't know that she, mom is reading The Second Sex, or, you know, certain books that were, she wasn't reading Betty Friedan, or maybe if she did, she's probably critiquing it, or maybe she wasn't, right? So it's those kinds of conversations about what was in the culture and how did different people receive it, which is different than I think what you would see in just kind of a show that was generally about the feminist movement, or about, you know, just, you know, white women in 1968. Just kind of different realities. So that's, I think those are the kind of debates we have in the room, as opposed to kind of looking up certain facts and things that happen. Of course, we make sure it's accurate. Like we want to make sure we have the dates of the Vietnam War right when we do an episode, but we don't have anyone on staff who takes care of that. So my research was just, you know, we all watched a lot of documentaries. It was pretty fun, actually. A lot of documentaries. Summer of Soul was something that we all watched that was really fantastic. Going on trips to the local African American History Museum, they had a lot of exhibits that were really relevant to stuff we were talking about at the time. And then just books and stuff on the era. So it was kind of just everyone coming in with their own, with things that they found interesting about the era and bringing that to the table.
Well, that's beautiful to build a story, and then everyone's got that interest and you build on each other.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask about the makeup of your writing room, and I'm going to go to you first because you said it was an educated room, and that's interesting. So does that mean people with particular backgrounds in this history that you're dealing with, or just meant that they had experiences in that area, or just they all went to really cool, they're all from Harvard? I don't know.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, everyone, you know, a lot of people have advanced degrees in the room. We've got folks like I have a PhD in sociology and was a gender studies, you know, a specialization. And we've got folks who just have studied a wide breadth of things. And it's really helpful in a show where you're writing about a bunch of different characters, because they're bringing in just a wide range of experiences. And I think that's what's important for our show is not necessarily expertise on a particular era, but having a wide range of like life experiences, because we're telling stories about 18 people's lives all at the same time. So that's really important for our room. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So Danielle, what's the makeup of your room, and how is, you know, where are the balance and who specializes in what sort of thing?
Yeah, no, it's very varied. You know, that there are, you know, our current showrunner Matthew B. Roberts is, you know, got such vast and varied experiences, and he very much, you know, likes to go and visit different locations, and you know, we you know, visited sites of colonial America and those sorts of things, and in Scotland, you know, making sure to go to all these different places. And yeah, people just with varied experiences, as Amberia is saying, you know, I think that's really important because, you know, you need that different sort of that sort of color, you know, to kind of bring things to life. I think that's really important. And we, you know, we have researchers and, you know, as well. And yeah, sorry, I'm sort of rambling, I think. But
no, how many people are on your staff? Let's just go right down to that. How many people?
At the moment, we're quite a small room. There's only, I think, gosh, I can't do maths. Classic writer syndrome. Four of us in the room currently. So a very small room. Yeah, and sort of people who've been working in the industry a very, very long time, and then someone like myself who's relatively new. So yeah, it's
a balance.
Yeah, good balance.
Beautiful. Robbie, what was the Dickinson Room like?
Yeah, also very balanced. You know, our room was always a bit different every season, which kind of kept it fresh, I think. Elena is a playwright, you know, and so we had a lot of playwrights. We had actors who were in the show in our writers' room, which was a very interesting perspective and something that I had never experienced that before, but it was incredibly useful. And some just, you know, some good TV heads who, you know, can remind you of the basic mechanics of how a TV show is supposed to work sometimes when you've strayed off into some very obscure storyline that you thought maybe was interesting, but probably belongs on, off Broadway. Someone's like, okay, where's Emily? What's she doing? How's this episode going to work? You need that too. So a whole range.
Well, that's excellent. We've got a couple questions that I think are very interesting because of being in a historical period. This is largely, we'll see how everyone responds to this, but how you handle language and the changing of language from the different eras. I know Dickinson is a little bit famous for the younger people speak more like they're from today, and the older characters tend to have a little bit of that, what we're used to, not necessarily thee and those, but that sort of more formal language. So how did you decide about language that would be comfortable for an audience, but still true to the period?
Yeah, as you said, we had a very distinct, very distinctive, a very big distinctive choice that Elena had made that was right there in the pilot. A lot of the show is about the difference between these generations. So having a little bit of a difference in the language there really helped that. Our show was so difficult because it was kind of a blend, so you just kind of knew it when you saw it, and either it worked on the page or it didn't, or it worked in someone's mouth and it didn't. And this is where it's useful to have such a you have someone who's kind of created the show, has been there the whole way through, like Elena. When you have a tone like that, you kind of need a guiding voice at the top of it to make these ultimate decisions. Yeah.
Excellent. Danielle, language issues?
Yeah, no, actually, this is one of my favorite elements of the show. I'm such a nerd. I love the Oxford English Dictionary has all of the historical etymologies of all the different words. And I kind of very geekishly and nerdishly love looking through to make sure that the word is period appropriate. Obviously, sometimes you have to take a little bit of poetic license. But, I think all of our characters are so distinct in their kind of the way that they speak. Jamie uses Scottish dialect, Claire is 1940s, and so Brianna, if she were alive today, would be an older lady. So I love thinking about the slang that would have been used or not used, and using that to kind of color the dialogue. And it's really interesting, making sure that the characters can understand each other, because I think it's easy to forget sometimes that just because we're very familiar with a word, you can't necessarily include it in the show. So, for example, the word "okay" is banned on Outlander because, but it comes so naturally to write. Oh, he says "okay," but they don't have that word. So, so it's really fun to kind of delve into that aspect of it.
Oh, that's so interesting, because yes, language is fascinating, and to think what suited then and doesn't suit. Oh, that's so beautiful. And I know the 60s aren't that far different, but we know they also are. So how do you guys deal with language?
Yeah, I wish we had a book or a dictionary, or the hardest part for us is just finding what junior hires were saying at the time, right? Because we kind of have a handle on, or can find words and phrases that adults were using, but what were kids talking about in the 60s? So that's kind of our toughest thing. And then words that were off limits that maybe, it's kind of trying to find that balance. That's our toughest task, is figuring out what was the language of even in high school, like just to get those variations, right? The differences between, like, Dean is 12, right? Kisa's 12, and his sister is 16, and then the brother is 20, right? So how are they all kind of speaking differently, and how do we show those age differences and maturity through language?
That's beautiful. I'm really interested, and there's a couple questions about this in the Q&A, the concept that you're all coming from a different bit or style of IP, right? We're coming from a set of poems, we're coming from an actual set of books with given storylines, and we're coming from rebooting a different show in this whole entirely different milieu. So can you talk a little bit about your process of sort of adapting, what do you use from the IP? How do you decide what not to use from it? What you can defer from, that sort of thing?
mean, I guess I'll start in that structurally, you know, the Wonder Years is told through Dean's perspective. He's got to see everything, which is our most difficult task, right? Is putting him in every room, particularly because in this reimagining of it, right, the other characters are very prominent, more so than in the original, which was really heavily centered on Kevin's experience. But now, you know, the mom, the sister, Kisa, like all of these characters, right, are so prominent. So how do we get Dean to overhear a conversation between his mom and sister? That's a private conversation he probably shouldn't hear when we're talking about things that are very specific, right? We have to honor that. That is a task that we are still figuring out. And it is all his memory. So that we have to honor. And that gives us a little bit of license, right? Because it's like, oh, maybe he didn't remember that accurately, or this is kind of his version of what that would have been. But that's what we've got to stick to. And it makes it interesting to kind of see our interpretation of a 12-year-old's interpretation of a particular event.
It's beautiful, but you're true. That is the structure that you've inherited. And
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. But it also means you could delve into the concept of memory and
Yes.
what is memory and what is true versus what we remember it to be.
Exactly.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. Okay. Danielle or Robbie?
We try to stay as faithful to the books as we can insofar as production allows us. You know, there are certain things that sometimes you just can't do because you can't get that particular thing, maybe where you're filming, or, you know, there are restrictions of that. But on the whole, you know, I would say that there's a lot of heated debate in the room as to which scenes we like. You know, it's very subjective. There are lots of beautiful emotional moments that we, you know, want to maybe include. So often the focus is on that kind of emotional content. But I would say, you know, as well, a lot of people, you know, sometimes with any show that's adapted from a book, you'll have, you know, critics who say, well, that's not what I imagined, you know, that's not how I pictured it. But at the same time, I would say that, you know, in reading a book, as your eyes, you know, travel over those words, you're bringing your own experiences to that, and you're creating your own adaptation in your head anyway. So really, reading is a form of adaptation in the first place. So yeah, I think we do try to be as faithful as we can. Yeah.
Excellent. Coming from a set of poetry.
Yeah, as I said, poetry, and then obviously this incredible biography. You know, one of the good things and the bad things about doing historical stuff is you have this incredible kind of treasure chest of amazing stuff, and you have to be so ruthless. You know, particularly sort of as the show built, we had all these, we were building these other characters that we were very interested in, and, you know, it was always very important to make sure that Emily was still the focus. We were seeing the show through her eyes, and so we might have this incredible gem of a weird thing that someone would do in the 19th century, but it just didn't fit into the story, and sort of building up on research and kind of tanking up, but then also just being willing to like let it all go and not be too attached and focus on the story. You know, we didn't have a book, you know, we didn't have a book that, you know, that had like a loyal following, but we did have a figure that has a very loyal following. So yeah, it's a tricky one. There's good and bad to it.
Perfect. That's true. I don't want to stray away from what we promised we talk about, which of course is the historical fiction, but we're also seeing some questions here that have to do, of course, with you individually as writers. And one of them that's popping up often is for Amberia. And how did you make a transition from academia to television writing? And what do you like about both of those worlds? You know, when you see the strengths of that, what made you make the transition?
Ooh, well, TV writing is it's more fun. It's It is way more fun, and it's interesting. I mean, it's still a bunch of people reading your stuff. You get notes just from a network and not a committee, and it's just as excruciating. But you get paid more doing it this way. But no, I was in a doctorate program in sociology, and was teaching and doing all of the things, and thought that that's what I was going to do. And then I actually started doing stand-up comedy just randomly. There was a friend who knew a friend who was like, hey, you're funny, you should take this class. And I was like, I'm actually taking a lot of classes right now. I don't have a bunch of time. But I was writing jokes and in a notebook, and I was like, nobody saves jokes for later. You're crazy or you're a stand-up. It turns out it's both. So I started doing stand-up, and as I was out kind of working, there were opportunities to kind of write in rooms, and it started out with non-scripted, in the unscripted world, just like a lot of comedy stuff, and that turned into write a script and have a sample, and then I just started submitting for writing gigs. So my foray into a writer's room was a little bit different, but it did start out in stand-up comedy and writing, in comedic formats, and then developing my own script and submitting that and getting hired. And the Wonder Years is my second room. So it's a nice second job to have. So this is all kind of new for me as well. I spent a lot of time writing in the unscripted world. Well, not a lot of time, but a year or so. So it can happen quite quickly. There's no real formula to it. But yeah, and I finished my PhD kind of all at the same time. So if there are specific questions about that, folks, we can talk offline if you're considering not finishing, just maybe try to finish, because you can do all of the things.
There you go. You can do all of the things. That's wonderful. But similarly, Danielle, you obviously went from the historical consultant world. Were you consulting on other shows, or was Outlander the first thing that you were consulting on?
It's the first thing. So similar to Amberia, I was also doing studying for a PhD, and then during that time, it just so happened that some of my expertise fell in line with that of the show, and I'd done a bit of musical theatre background long ago and things like that, and so I came to the set and would advise on anything from etiquette matters, or the more kind of esoteric or kind of story type points that needed research or anything like that, and then became an assistant to the executive producers there, and worked my way up that way. So
very cool.
It was an interesting journey, and I think there are definitely similarities, as you say, between the academic world and TV. But yeah, there are definitely some positives to TV writing for sure, and it is a very satisfying job that you actually feel like you can maybe bring some of the kind of more obscure bits of knowledge to light in some way. So I think that's
I think that at a certain point I was like, more people probably watch the show than read my dissertation. So if I can just apply a little bit of my expertise to this show that folks are going to watch, then hey, that's kind of what I wanted. But yeah, that's very interesting. Consulting is something a lot of scholars do. So it's nice that it kind of landed in the writer's room, which is really nice.
That's beautiful. And of course, that's happened in the past. We've had lawyers as consultants, doctors as consultants have become writers because of finding out also that, as almost what Amberia was saying too, building on that, the television program is this larger lectern where the message you have is going to go out to such a larger class or larger room full of people. And that's a really powerful thing. Beautiful. Robbie, we might as well follow up with how you ended up in the Dickinson Room. And there have been some questions about, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but a male writing a female, how much work the research of that has been. I believe Dickinson has been done quite well, but we would like to hear how you got in that room and how you think about working with a female character and being as true as you can to a world that isn't yours.
I was waiting for this question. I got onto this show. I had written on other shows, and sadly I wasn't doing a degree, which so
don't be sad. That's probably the best.
I know. I feel I should have been on this panel. So I had a slightly more conventional route, kind of, writing scripts on my own. Eventually got noticed, got into a room. I had worked in I think I'd been on 3 probably comedy shows before then. And then honestly, the script, Elena had written this incredible script. And this often happens, you get they're just kind of bouncing around Hollywood, and everyone's like, you got to read this script. And hers was one of those. And it's an amazing read, but it takes someone brave to actually say, oh, we should make this. This is a quite esoteric show about Emily Dickinson. Apple happened to have just come onto the scene as a new buyer, and I think we're looking to make an impression, and they were wowed by the script the same way I was. Anyway, when I read this script, I just basically elbowed anyone in my vicinity to try and get a meeting on it. But as someone, I'm love history. I have a classics and history degree. That plus comedy is a very rare thing in this industry. Yeah. So when I read this thing, I was like, I have to get on it. Luckily, Elena was willing to meet, and I think I charmed her. And then I basically made it so that she could never get rid of me because I love the show so much. And I feel like there was a second part to that question, which was about what was it like. At the end of the day, there was stuff I was able to contribute more than probably other stuff. I don't bring a female perspective to the storytelling, but I was always listening to what people were saying. I was reading stuff and I was trying to contribute. And then there's the mechanics of storytelling and working with the clay you have. And there are many ways to contribute. Even if you maybe don't have the authenticity to speak for the main character, and the more I did it, the more I learned it, and yeah, it was the highlight of my career, definitely.
Well, that's beautiful. And true, obviously we need everyone to write about everyone, because then that respects everyone's reality as being worth telling, obviously. Beautiful. Another question that's popped up, and this is for Danielle and Robbie, and I bet you're going to guess that question, which is, how do 2 people who seem not to have American accents be writing about American history? How do you come into that? And how do you feel about that? How much did you know about American history, and how much did you sort of have to dive into? There's that classic, we can't recite all the kings of England, but then you can see a game show from England and they can't pick out where the states are, or they can't name a certain number of presidents outside of Lincoln and Washington. So how much did you have to do to sort of get up to speed in knowing what are the big moments that you need to know more about in American history?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, firstly, I would say that, with colonial American history, obviously lots of that is British history because, it was a British colony. But on the other hand, I do think that there are a lot of people who kind of sometimes make the mistake of assuming that just because you maybe are British or American, that means you inherently have some sort of knowledge about something. But really, you have to put the work in to learn it, whether that's, my own culture and history or, in America. And I think because we're also bringing in characters from Scotland as well who are coming to America, that was something that was helpful. But I've had to do so much, research and work, and I've actually just have a little baby American son, and I feel like I've done a good job of getting ahead. So when he asks me when is the Battle of Alamance, I can tell him, and it's a battle that nobody has ever heard of, but I know when that one is. And I think there's a lot of work that goes into it. But,
you've probably done better, or going to do better than most Americans.
It's been very kind of interesting. It's not something that I ever imagined that I would be kind of so focused on, but I'm glad. And I think now that I do live here, I think it's important to kind of, learn about the place that you live, and to find out as much as you can about it and about the history and what makes America, really.
Yeah, I would say that I, as someone who moved here, I feel a kind of debt that I need to pay off to know more about this place. So I'm constantly feel like I'm trying to catch up and read stuff. It's funny. I would say 4 people out of 10 that you tell them you're doing a show about Emily Dickinson will say, wasn't she British?
Really?
So the first thing I can successfully say to them is no, she was from New England. But yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to pretend I was an Emily Dickinson scholar going in, but when I had read some of her poetry, I knew she was someone that I wanted to know more about, because she's someone you hear about, but you're not taught in British schools. And this script and the opportunity I was given on the show was just a great chance to do what I love doing anyway, which is to just dig into something and learn about it. And it it's not often that you get to work on a show where you can go down some incredible wormholes, historical wormholes, and then get to try and pitch them as an episode. It's a real gift. So yeah, but American history is something I'm always trying to understand more, and I'm constantly reading about.
Beautiful. I remember being, I guess it was at the Tower of London, and reading, it was all about different British soldiers, where they'd gone, and there was a little plaque about a particular group, and it was, they'd gone to the colonies, in this, and I was like, wait, and they came back. But they came back losing, because that's the American Revolution, and they didn't really explain that on the plaque. And I thought, oh, interesting, different perspective. We'll just ignore that part. If we went there, we did some stuff, we came home, we won't talk about why. It's very funny. Very funny. Cool. What I'd love to do, we only have about 20 minutes. This will give us some time. I'd love to hear kind of whether it's a day in the life, or whether it's a case study of a particular script you wrote, a very little bit of like, here was the piece of research we found, here was how it molded into a story, and this was a particular point of that I was really pleased of, a script of yours, of course, that you wrote. Can you give us kind of that blow by blow on a particular script you're very pleased with? I know there's much thinking.
I mean, sorry, so it was a sort of day in the life, and then
or a case study of a particular script, one of
Right.
your favorite scripts that you wrote that came from a piece of research and you built into a story.
Mine was this last season. So I had this idea. I've always been, I think I mentioned earlier, but Dante is someone I love, and I was obsessed with this idea of Emily going down into the underworld at some point. It's a sort of a tradition of poets to go down there, and so I think I had pitched that at some point, and then Elena, luckily, when we were doing the Civil War season, said, well, actually, I think this could be a good opportunity for her to do it, and so we started. That was sort of in the back of our minds for this season, like, is there an opportunity for that to happen? We found it sort of towards the end, and it was a sort of a chance for Emily to go down, and kind of, it was almost the all is lost moment of the season, if we're thinking in kind of story terms. And yeah, she said I could write it, which was fabulous. And it was interesting to have that one kind of, I would say that one was, I'd pitched it probably 2 years before, so it was always kind of hanging there. And it was funny because we then ended up shooting it in a pandemic, and I feel like the Inferno became something of a metaphor for trying to make a TV show in a pandemic. But that one I'm proud of. Yeah.
So how fun. Love Dante because I'm Sicilian American, so that was a big deal with my grandparents. We have to read Dante. Excellent. Thank you so much. Danielle or Amberia?
I mean, mine are so much less, intense as reading Dante's Inferno and like all of the research that
I brought that upon myself. I just want to
It's a different perspective. We're looking for a range of
Yeah.
perspectives to provide the audience. It's nothing. It's
I wrote an episode about Dean going to his church's lock-in, and that was a fun thing to mine, not just for me, but all of the folks in the room who had that experience of being locked in their church, right, at this junior high rite of passage, where they think that's a great idea to put all of these very hormonal children in one space and leave them unsupervised for 24 hours. So it was really just revisiting, my own past. I went through a bunch of photo albums and found there's a scene with a baptismal pool. So I went and found all of those pictures of my baptism and and it kind of was a personal, revisiting. That was the research that I was doing. And we kind of used that for one of the central scenes in the show where Dean and his girlfriend fall into the baptismal pool, which is just such a, it's like heresy, blasphemy, all of those bad things. But that was a fun thing to do. And the episode is really just about kind of turning those gender roles of boys going into this space thinking that they are going to make selections about who they'll be with. And it really is all of the girls, main characters and guest characters who are all, going, no, we're going to make the choices and you guys can kind of just deal with it. So it was a fun way to kind of turn those gendered expectations on their head about how junior high partner selection works. And doing that in a church, which was kind of fun.
Beautiful. Thank you. We're gonna speak in a minute about like bringing your own self and your own stories to these pieces, even though historical. So you've already stepped us in that right direction. But I want to give Danielle a chance to think about kind of a case study, an episode of a piece of history she liked bringing into a story.
It's tricky. I wrote an episode where, it's obviously based on the book, and in the book, the character Roger is hanged at the Battle of Alamance, where he's mistaken for the opposite side, and sort of bringing that to life was very interesting, and I chose to do that through the medium of kind of playing with silent movie, and because he loses his voice, and metaphorically he couldn't find his words, and so he'd have this PTSD moments, and they would appear as kind of silent film, and I really enjoyed being able to kind of play with that kind of that 18th century aspect, but also bring in a little bit of the future, and to try and imagine how characters are perceiving themselves and their own pain and their own trauma, and how other characters do as well. And in that same episode, it's quite a dark and depressing episode, but there's Jocasta, who's played by Maria Doyle Kennedy. She sings a traditional Scottish funeral lament for the love of her life, who sadly dies at that same battle. And I really love kind of being able to kind of go back and research those songs and listen to those, and see what emotion that conjures in you as you're writing, and I love being able to bring those things to life. That's a little treat, to being able to kind of pick a song that you like and have that in the episode. I think that's really lovely sometimes.
Oh, beautiful. Definitely. Again, personalizing it to yourself. That means it's definitely something you brought into the world. Beautiful. Okay, so now we'll go backwards and do the whole day in the life. In terms of writing, how much time do you spend when you're not in a room, let's say? How much time do you spend writing? How much are you writing your own personal stuff on top of what you're writing for your show? How much time do you walk around just to clear your head? What's a day in the life for each of you?
Can start if you want.
Sure.
Currently we're working on season 7, so when we're working, we tend to be in the room 5-ish hours a day or more, depending. Sometimes they're very long days, sometimes they can be a little bit shorter, depending on if we're in filming at that moment. When we're filming in Scotland, we have a lot of production meetings to attend, and costume and makeup and all those fun things. But I like to kind of make sure that I spend time doing kind of more cultural things, or things that kind of are totally unrelated to writing. Because I think a lot of writing actually, and maybe not for everybody, but for some people, happens when you're not sitting in front of your computer, but actually up here when you're in the shower or on a nice walk somewhere or doing something totally crazy or seeing a show or, you know, whatever the thing may be, which is a little bit more difficult in a pandemic, of course, but you know, I suppose if you're creative, you can find ways to have outlets. But I think it's, you know, trying to have as many new experiences as you can and feeding those into whatever you're doing is really helpful to the process.
Beautiful, beautiful.
I agree. I think the days depend on where we are in production, right? They go from tame to crazy. And it also depends on, you know, your position as a writer in the room. You have different responsibilities. So that shifts as your seniority changes. So we are in production and writing, and we're you know, nearing the end of the season. So we're kind of wrapping up, breaking the last few episodes. So we kind of work collaboratively, which is nice. And then when you're off writing your thing. And that, of course, is a consuming thing. But outside of that, just in terms of a daily schedule, since the pandemic, I take morning walks, and they used to be much longer, but like an hour or two just to myself and my brain and my music and my thoughts, or a podcast. And that's just kind of creative, let your mind go where it goes time. So whatever that looks like for you, you know, sometimes that's working out, sometimes that's a drive, or, you know, whatever space. I try to make time for me to have that time for creative, fun release time. So that's, you know, kind of echoing Danielle's point. So much of creative thought comes when I'm not trying to have it. So.
True. Excellent. A good piece of advice. Relaxing brings those thoughts forward. Beautiful. Robbie, what's a day in the life?
Yeah, just to echo a lot of that. I mean, one of the things I love about TV, working in TV, is that there is a more of a social aspect to it, and also your life is not always that repetitive. Like, if you know, there was a bunch of months last year where I was in New York on set, you know, and that's a very different you know, schedule to when it's just me banging my head against my desk. So you know, we actually, our production and our writers' room was always separate. We always were going into production with all our scripts already written, which is not that typical, although becoming more typical, I think, as TV enters the streaming era. So yeah, I mean, if it's just, I'm a morning person, so I basically am functional creatively until about 12, and then as soon as like lunch happens, it all just goes off a cliff. So I try and get everything that I need to do done in the morning with some walks to as has been said, to clear my mind, and that's usually when the brain sparks happen anyway. So.
And can I just add to that anyone who's working on a spec script or working on trying to complete something, that the lesson that I learned is to just write it. As a perfectionist, as someone who really wanted something to be perfect, that was like the biggest obstacle, was me. Write whatever, I mean, whatever is coming to you, just write that thing. I found that it's easier to revise than it is to start from scratch. So it feels like less of a feat if you have something. So if that's something that you're working on in your spare time, just write it. Don't be your own enemy trying to perfect it or write to a particular thing, unless that is what you have been tasked to do. Don't try to write to what's popular. Don't try to write to what is on TV, or write to what thematically you've been told by your people you should write. Just write what's real to you and get it done. So, I mean, that consumed my time early on in the pandemic. So if anyone is at that stage, then that is my advice, is to just finish it.
That's a beautiful piece of writing advice. I think that's wonderful for people to hear at whatever stage they're in, to remember that part. The perfectionism is what kills you. Sadly. Okay, before we go, I want to think one more question about history, and that is going to be simply, if you got to pick a time period that you would write about, obviously divorced from the shows that you're on right now, what's a period you would love to divulge more truth about?
I mean, I'm always trying to get do ancient Rome is sort of my big passion, which is very hard. I'm sure Danielle and Amberia have found that when you go into rooms and start telling people you want to do period shows, particularly that far back, you get like huge eye rolls, and the meeting's essentially over. But maybe one day it won't be. That's I just think there's so many resonances between that particular bit of history and our own and what we're living through right now, and the echoes of and you know, just if you just look at the way this country is constructed and where that came from, I just think we're going through a lot of what that empire went through before it fell. So I want to mind that, but whether I'll be allowed to is another matter.
There you go. Always. That's about pitching around town and hitting the right person at the right time. Cool. Danielle or Amberia?
I think, yeah, something that's very kind of a passion project for me is I'm from Wales originally, and Welsh is my first language. And there's a lot of Celtic culture related to Wales, myths and legends that I'd love to do that kind of center quite far back in time. So again, probably similar to Robbie in that it's kind of the Romans, I think, were around when the Celts, you know, kind of were still there. So yeah, that sort of period really interests me, but yeah, really just kind of, for me it's more about the culture than the specific time period, but the way in which that kind of evolves over time. Yeah, I think as one of my colleagues likes to say, I think Scotland has a really great PR person. England is doing, everybody knows what England is. Wales, nobody's ever heard of it, even though King Arthur is from there. We've got all sorts of exciting things, but no one seems to know anything about it. So that's going to be my mission, I think.
Well,
there's your pitch right there.
Exactly. And if you're a Doctor Who fan, you know Cardiff and you know Wales. You can't miss that. Come on. Yeah. How fun. Amberia, what period interests you?
Ooh, so I just love a period piece in general. That's just my heart, and it's tough. As a Black woman, period pieces are never fun. A lot of people of color don't like them because history is not always fun. So I don't have a particular era. I just like rediscovering people of color in the past in an honest way, in a full way. So I would work on any project where that is the objective. And I think using comedy as the vehicle is my particular bread and butter. That's what I enjoy. That's what I would like to watch. I get that that's a difficult thing to do, kind of uncovering hard truths and realities through comedy. But that's what I love. Those are the movies and the series that speak to me. And I love when we kind of get a fuller picture of what really happened or what life might have really been like, outside of kind of some of the horrors that we know, or kind of using a different lens to see those. And sometimes I think that is the storyteller that makes all the difference. So that's how I hope to pitch period pieces, as difficult as they are. And sometimes it's not because they don't connect, because I agree with everyone else that they're very relatable. Like, you know, we're just people doing the same shit over time again. Like that's what it is, and hopefully getting a little bit better. But they're expensive, and it's hard to recreate those worlds. That's one of the main gripes at the Wonder Years. So have a budget. I mean, have some folks in the room that can help you actually make the show. I think that's a big part of it. But as long as you've got an interesting POV and it can be made, I think, you know, there's always going to be a world where people want to watch them.
I agree with that completely. I think we've often talked about why networks always say they don't want historical fiction, and then look at how much we do find on the air. When it hits, and there's clearly an audience, right? Beautiful. Well, I always like to end. I know many of the folks in the audience, of course, are writers or working on becoming writers. And so Amberia gave us a piece of advice. I'm open to another piece from her. And then, of course, a piece from Danielle and Robbie before we go. Kind of a last thing to leave people with as they're moving forward in their writing careers. What would you say is the most important thing you learned along the way that you'd pass on?
I think in terms of the writing itself, I think the delete button is your friend, and don't be scared of it. Words are free. You can write as many of them as you want. You don't have to worry about it. Just, go for it. And just edit carefully. And I think that's it.
Editing is very important. Robbie?
I have two that have come to me. One is to just, and it can be very, very hard, is to try and set yourself deadlines, because it's easy when you're on a show and your showrunner is saying you need to get this done by tomorrow night, and then you just do it. But when it's just you, I usually try and tell my wife I'm going to have something finished, or do something to try and put it out there so that I have to complete it. And the other is just on sometimes what I find when I'm struggling, we all have that moment where we're really excited by an idea and it's, the fun new thing. And then we kind of make some choices about it. And then it's really, suddenly it's not fun anymore and we want to do something else. Something I found useful recently is to just try and remember what that initial spark was, that initial idea, why you thought that was a good idea. And it doesn't matter if you keep having to come back to it and going off in another direction, but always maybe just pin it to your wall or something. I do that just to remind you why you fell in love with this idea to begin with. And then sometimes that can help you finish it.
That's beautiful in terms of people sometimes don't realize the length of time they'll be living with an idea once they put it out in the world. I'm going to ask Amberia if she wants to take us home with one more thing.
I'll say that get used to critique, get used to notes and people having things to say. And that's really difficult when these are your babies and your thoughts and your ideas. And sometimes it's your show and your vision. That's other writers in the room, that's executive producers, that's networks and studios, and then it's the audience, and then it's Twitter. People are always going to have something to say about your work. And the more comfortable you can get with that process of critique and kind of echoing what Robbie said is remember that spark of what you liked about what you did is important. I think that's if I learned anything in grad school, it was that I'm going to have to write this thing a million times, over and over and over and over again, and it's going to get further and further away from what I thought I wanted it to be. But that's just a part of it. It's rewriting, it's collaboration, it's concession, and in the end, hopefully, you get to make something that you're really proud of for a long time.
That is such a beautiful sentiment to end with. I have to say thank you to all of you for joining us. I know you're very busy people, and having you step out for a moment and share these ideas with everybody has been wonderful. And I thank you so much. Please have a lovely and safe rest of this 2022.
Thanks everyone who watched, and thanks to
who participated.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming. We'll see you soon.